Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hope and Healing Chats, where we discuss everything dealing with sex addiction and partner betrayal trauma. I will be your host, Monifa Ellis-Addie, and I've been working in this field for several years now with individuals and couples. Today's topic, we'll be getting into the nuances of erectile dysfunction and how that relates to sex addiction and porn addiction. But first, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. So, our special guest today, she is the clinical director of Creating Change LA, and she's also a LMFT and certified sex therapist and sex therapy supervisor. She has previously worked at the Center of Healthy Sex in West LA, as well as Cliffside Malibu and Recover Integrity, where she assisted men in drug and alcohol recovery and developing healthy, intimate relationships. She regularly contributes to many news articles, podcasts, and websites as a sex therapy expert. She is also the creator of the e-course When It's Hard to Stay Hard, to assist men in overcoming erectile dysfunction. Welcoming my good friend, Natalie Finegood Goldberg.
Hello. Thank
Thanks
you
for
for
being
having
here.
me.
So, erectile dysfunction, I know this is your bread and butter. That's
It
why I wanted to have
is.
you
It
on.
is.
I imagine there's a lot of shame and stuff around these conversations because even me working in sex addiction and porn addiction, it comes up, but it's kind of, skewed over,
Sort of
like we don't really get into it.
ancillary.
Exactly. So, first of all, just enlighten us. What, at its base core, what is erectile dysfunction?
So, erectile dysfunction, there is a misconception that if you have an experience in which you lose your erection, you have erectile dysfunction. That is not the
Mm.
case. That just means you lost your erection. In order for it to be like full-blown diagnostic erectile dysfunction, it has to happen more than like 7 out of 10 times. Or sorry, it has to happen, yes. So like for every 7 or every 10 times that you have sex, if you lose your erection 3 or more, then,
Mhm.
it's got to happen more than 30% of the time for it to qualify as actual erectile dysfunction. But the DSM also has this sort of like caveat of if you don't get an erection when you want one, which is also kind of like a catch-all. So
Yeah.
like the real medical diagnosis, is it happening like a lot? Is it happening frequently? Is it happening the majority of the time? Not sort of like, is it happening once in a while? Is it happening once a month and you're having regular sex? Like it really has to happen with some regularity for it to be like full-blown erectile dysfunction. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. And the minute it happens, they assume that like they have the plague and they're done and they're toast.
Yeah.
So I've definitely had people reach out to me and like, even just on the intake call, they're like, oh my God, this happened. I'm like, well, has it happened before? No, this is the first time. It's like, oh, okay. Well, like you could be fine. Like this could not be a thing. And then they're like, oh, and there's so much relief that comes with that. And then I never hear from them again.
Yes.
So yes, so it has to happen with some frequency and some regularity, in the sense that either you cannot get an erection or you get an erection, but you cannot maintain it. Yeah.
And in relation to what you were just saying about like if it happens just once and you get these calls, I guess that kind of plays into like the myths around it, like that men are supposed to be
Yes.
on at all times and ready no matter what.
Absolutely.
This only
Right.
happens when you're old.
Right.
Viagra can cure it. Like,
Right.
yeah, can you give us
Like,
more
yeah, I
about?
would say like another myth that is sort of like the idea of like, well, my partner wants to have sex, so I should be able to get hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, well, they might want sex. Are you in the mood? Are you up for it? Are you tired? Is that on your mind? So yes, I would say it's definitely a myth that like a man should be able to have sex whenever the moment strikes. The reality is like, their body just might not be up for it, Yeah.
I mean, we're
So
all
I would say,
human.
right. The one that drives me absolutely bonkers is in heterosexual couples when the assumption is made that if your partner has erectile dysfunction, it means he's gay. That one drives me off
Mm.
the wall. Who knows? Maybe they are not attracted to you and that's why, but usually it has significantly more to do with like just what's happening in their body, what's happening in their stress levels, etc. Like sexual orientation is a whole other animal.
Yeah, like that's a big
So
jump to go
it's a
from
leap. It's
that
a
to
leap. It's a
homosexual.
leap. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, how does all this play into sex and porn addiction?
So I get a lot of there's sort of two ways that it plays out. And it plays out differently with sex addicts than it does with porn addicts.
Okay.
So what I see a lot with sex addicts is that sex for people who struggle with sex addiction is not intimate. It's about the chase,
Hmm.
it's about the pursuing, it's about the conquering, it's about the conquest, and it's not about connection, it's not about intimacy. And so where I see it playing out with people who struggle with sex addiction is that, like, when they have a partner that they deeply care about, and that they feel very close to, it's very challenging for them to get an erection. It's sort of like they only know how to have sex with people that they don't really care about. They only
Hmm.
know how to have sex with people who they, fully objectify. And it's like, sort of, once they move into intimacy, it's like, it's not working. I don't know what to do. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I would say that's how it plays out for people who struggle with sexual addiction. For people who struggle with porn addiction, it's a little bit of a different animal in the sense that, like, it kind of just doesn't work. Like, they sort of only know how to get aroused with porn. It's sort of like their body has become conditioned to respond only to porn. Um,
Mm.
and so, yeah, so it's just sort of like I want to be sexual with my partner, but, like, but it just doesn't seem to be as exciting. It's just not scratching the itch in the same way.
Yeah.
And so there's a few sort of question marks as to why that happens. It's sort of the question of, like, have they sort of conditioned their brain to only be aroused by, like, this rapid fire of images and dopamine and, pick 15 different sexual scenes all at once, pretty much. Like,
Hmm.
or there's also the piece of, like, if they've spent all their time and energy masturbating to porn, like, do they have nothing left in the tank? Like,
Yeah.
have they
Yeah.
sort of, like, used up all their resources, so to speak? And so, their refractory period is such that, like, they have not given themselves enough time to recover and they're sort of running on empty.
That's so interesting because I do always refer to sex addiction as an intimacy disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what you're saying with sex addiction, it is more about the intimacy aspect, but with porn addiction, there is the capability to be intimacy. It's more about you've kind of wired yourself or your brain to be aroused towards porn.
Mm-hmm.
So where it's in real
Right.
life, it's difficult.
Right. And I would say, like, there is also an element of sort of a struggle with intimacy with the
Okay.
porn piece, because the other thing that I find is that oftentimes people who get aroused for porn, but not for sort of face to face intimacy, there
Mhm.
is something going on in terms of what they're watching versus the sex they're having. There's a freedom in what they're able to access and watch in the porn that they don't feel as comfortable sharing with their partner. There's, like, a level of
Mhm.
excitement, there's a level of vulnerability, there's a level of sort of letting themselves go in a different way that they don't seem to be able to do with their partner.
Got you. So the intimacy still, so it's not that they have a greater capacity for intimacy because it's porn addiction. It just shows up differently.
Right. Like, it kind of manifests differently.
Got you. Um, so then this is actually a good segue with partners of someone that has erectile dysfunction. Because you mentioned it before, like how to say, like, does this mean that they're homosexual? Like, how does someone communicate? Like, how do they talk about this in an effective manner that the partner doesn't think that it's them or, trying to, I don't know, do backflips and all these extra things to try to get them aroused?
So I'm a big fan of front loading. I encourage people to talk about it from the jump. It automatically reduces the anxiety around it. And one of the things
Mhm.
we know about ED is that it's hugely anxiety based. And so if you get ahead of it, hey, I just want to give you a heads up. This might happen, might not, but, like, just in case it does, like, don't be alarmed. This is what my body does sometimes. And so by front loading
Mhm.
it, it already sort of takes some of the pressure off the person of, like, is it going to happen, is it going to happen, am I going to disappoint them, and, like, the expectation is set. So I'm a big fan of the front loading piece. The other piece also, like, for partners, Like I really strongly encourage them not to take it personally. Like, there's that expression of like the largest sex organ is our brain, and like
Hmm.
whatever is happening in that person's brain, like it's happening between their ears. And so like a huge part of this process is what's happening in the man's brain and body. So I really encourage partners not to take it personally, not to let it sort of be a measure of their attractiveness or their worth or their value or their partner's love for them. Like it's like a biological function. Like, it's like
Yeah.
taking diabetes personally. Like
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah. I like
yeah.
that.
I mean, unless the
Yeah.
partner, like, unless there are some real, like, dynamics within the partnership that need addressing, I
Hmm.
would say, like, most of the time, your sort of run of the mill ED is something that is happening in the man's body and brain. Yeah.
You mentioned anxiety sometimes being like a large component. How does someone, you know, decipher if it's medical or if it's psychological?
So the baseline test, I mean, I always encourage people to see their medical professional. So always see a doctor. But I would say it's sort of like a baseline test for really questioning, is this medical or is this biological or medical or psychological, is, can you masturbate without any issue? So like, do your pipes work? Does the blood flow
Hmm.
work? And like, is it sort of, are you able to get aroused and achieve or experience an orgasm? Um, like, so again, yeah, like, does the physical bits and pieces work? And then also the question of, do you have like do you wake up with morning or nocturnal erections? So like, is your blood naturally flowing? Is everything kind of
Hmm.
doing what it's supposed to? In which case, like, the wild card is, another person in the room.
Yeah.
And so that's really where you sort of can draw the line of like, is this psychological or is this physical?
Yeah. Because if you are having, morning or nocturnal, it's things are functioning.
Right.
So,
Right.
okay.
Blood flow is
Oh.
going in there, blood flow is staying in there.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's not a blood flow issue.
So, what's happening in the body? Like, if we were to break it down, like on a physiological level, what's happening?
Am I allowed to swear?
I guess. Why not? No one's ever asked.
Okay. I
This
mean, we are
makes
talking
sense.
about sex. So everybody knows of fight or flight. So what happens in fight or flight is that all the blood flows to our hands and our legs because we either need to like fight or run.
Mhm.
And so the opposite of fight or flight is what some people call rest and digest. I call it fucking and feeding. Because
Um,
again, what's happening when we are not in fight or flight is that all of our blood is going to our core. And so if your pelvis area is getting blood flow, like, that's what we want. And so if you're in fight or flight, like, there's no blood going to your penis. It's going to your extremities because
mhm.
it's trying to protect you. And so the spike in cortisol that comes with anxiety, it just sends everything to your extremities. And so all the blood is moving in the opposite direction that you want it to. Whereas rest and digest, or fucking and feeding, we're calm, we're relaxed, all of the blood is going to our core, our pelvis. And so, like, that's exactly where you want it to go. So if a person is particularly anxious or if they're having a cortisol spike, then that really sort of defeats the purpose. I mean, the other thing
So,
is, like, if you think about it from like an evolutionary standpoint, if you are being chased by a bear in the woods, not the most opportune time to get an erection. Your
yeah.
body's not going to be like, "Hey, let's do this." So, like,
Exactly, yeah. Because the
it
cortisol spike is like, we are in danger.
right. We're in
So,
danger.
we
Let's
use energy
run.
for something else.
Right. Right, but
Okay.
there also can be sort of these subtle cortisol spikes in that, like, if somebody is particularly sensitive, or if they have like sort of a particularly heightened or active amygdala, and like they are somebody who is sort of highly anxious or highly nervous, their brain is constantly scanning the room. And so, like, they might be sort of watching for these micro movements, micro sort of aggressions from their partner, in which case, like, those can spike your cortisol. And like, it's like if your partner breathes the wrong way, looks at you the wrong way, like if
Mm-hmm.
you're particularly heightened awareness and sensitive to that, like that could spike your cortisol. That could be like, oh God, they're upset with me. Oh God, I'm not doing this right. Like whatever it might be, like that can spike it. The internal process of just the question arising of what if I lose my erection? Like that can spike it. Like these are all things that don't help the cause.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question, but we'll put a pin in that.
Okay.
So do you see this certain age groups? Because once again, the myth of this only happens to old people or, take Viagra. Like, is there certain age groups that you see being affected more than others?
So I found a study. It's in a youth and adolescent pediatric group, pediatric urology group. They found a 31% increase since 2014
Wow.
in reports of erectile dysfunction or clients seeking help for erectile dysfunction since 2014. So there is a
That's a lot.
huge spike in young adults. So there's also been a huge spike in general in young adults of anxiety disorders. So it could sort of
Mm-hmm.
go hand in hand with that because we know anxiety is a huge component of it. There's a huge spike in pornography use.
Yep.
Could go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, clients are getting younger and younger these days.
Right. Right.
Wow.
I think the other piece that, like, I'll stay off my soapbox, but I will just say sex education is really poor in this country. It's
Mm-hmm.
terrible. It's nothing. So,
Yeah.
I think people are in some regards maturing faster and faster, but they don't know what they're doing and they don't understand it all. And so just sort of the dearth of education, I think, could be setting really unrealistic expectations.
Yeah. So it's basically a
Yeah.
breeding ground for anxiety around sex.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So there is a huge spike in the sort of the 18 to 35 range. There was a massive study by I think it was like it was like the Boston erectile dysfunction study. At this point, it was about 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, it was sort of like once a person hits 50 years old, once a man hits 50 years old, they will have had a 50% chance that they've experienced erectile dysfunction. And it roughly went up 10% with each decade. So 50% at 50, 60% by 60, 70% by 70, etc. More recent studies are showing it a little bit lower,
Mhm.
but I'm inclined to go with the higher numbers. I think there
Yeah.
is, the widespread use of Cialis and Viagra. You can have it delivered to your doorstep without even having to sit face to face with a
Mhm.
doctor. Like it used to be, if you have to go into the doctor's office, you have to talk about it, you have to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Now, just a few clicks, and it's like, okay, it's at my door.
Yeah. Yes,
So,
naturally the numbers are gonna be lower, but it's not because they're actually no lower, it's just that they're
right,
managing it through pills
right,
and such.
yeah.
Um, we've been talking a lot about anxiety and how
Mhm.
that as a whole influences things, but what about, like, diet and exercise?
And diet and exercise can absolutely play a part in it. Like if you are particularly sedentary, that's not good for blood flow. Like again,
Mhm.
like the physicality of it is like it requires blood flow. There's research that shows that strength training and like high intensity interval training are good for increasing testosterone, which can also help with erection issues. I would say like one of the interesting things about testosterone is that like there are some studies that link it to erectile dysfunction and there are some studies that
Hmm.
don't. So it's potential that it is a myth that the two are connected. um,
Yeah.
Low testosterone can have a variety of other health issues. It can cause increased weight gain around the midline for men. It can create issues with estrogen as well, which can also impact desire. So it has sort of a roundabout role for sure, but there hasn't really been established been like a one-to-one link. um,
Hmm.
but yes, physicality wise, the other thing that I see is also like with the sedentary lifestyle, like if people are sitting at their desk, like I know like pelvic floor is something we hear a lot for women and like postpartum
Mhm.
women, and pelvic floor PT is like a really popular thing or becoming more popular for women and women's sexual issues. But I would say the reality is some men need it too. And I very regularly, frankly, send men to pelvic floor PT. If they have a particularly weak pelvic floor, it's not getting enough blood flow, it's not strong enough. Usually you see these issues in conjunction with any sort of like issues around urinary incontinence or fecal incontinence. It doesn't have to be quite that extreme for it to be a problem, but like those are always some like assessment questions I ask. Like if they have those issues, that's like a huge red flag that there is a
Mm-hmm.
weak pelvic floor situation happening. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research that does show that like heavy leg exercises, lifting weights, it is helpful for erections.
Which is interesting because I think lots of men don't realize that there's Kegel exercises for men. Like it's something that's always assigned to women.
Right. Yes. No, men can absolutely do Kegel exercises. They are tricky in the sense of, so Kegel exercises are certainly helpful for men with erectile dysfunction. They're also prescribed for men with premature ejaculation.
Mm.
However, you have to be really careful because sometimes for men who have premature ejaculation, they have an overly tight pelvic floor. And so if they're doing Kegels, they're worsening the problem. So here's also why I send people to a physical therapist. So the physical therapist can say,
Yes.
yes, it's weak, do Kegels, or no, it's too strong.
Oh.
Let's help you learn how to relax it and like stretch it and lengthen it rather than tighten it more and more and more.
Yeah, yeah. That's super interesting. Going back to the addiction piece, so if
Mhm.
someone has sobriety over the sex addiction and porn addiction, um, will they basically like cure the ED? Like, is it a 1-to-1 ratio? Does it work that way or not so much?
It's kind of like like it's sort of like sobriety is the bachelor's degree, and then
Yeah,
relearning how to
yeah,
have sex is the master's degree.
yeah.
Like, I would say like for some, it could just sort of flow seamlessly into their recovery. I would say for others, it really is a relearning process. They say with drug and alcohol addiction, you sort of like your emotions are sort of stunted at whatever age you started using. So if you started drinking
Hmm.
at 13, like when you get sober at 25, like part of you is still 13. And so I
Yeah.
would say kind of the same is true with sexual addiction. Like
Hmm.
there's like it's sort of like all those years of sex that kind of don't count. Like you didn't really learn anything helpful or good. So it's like you kind of have to go back to the beginning, start over and like relearn how to have sex.
Yeah. Which kind of reminds me of what I always say with and looking at sex and porn addiction, like that's like the tip of the iceberg. Like
Mhm.
that's just the symptoms of how this thing came out.
Right.
Whereas we have to deal with all the stuff, like that's sobriety, but then the other stuff is recovery, where we're
Right.
like getting into everything else. So kind of what you're
Right.
saying is we got to deal with the recovery stuff to be able to really handle
Right.
the ED component of it.
Right, exactly. And like, Patrick Carnes talks about like the four tenets of the sex addict. And the number one tenet
Hmm.
is sex is my most important need. And one of the other tenets is, nobody would understand this or people would judge me essentially for this need. Nobody can meet this need. So there's a lot of shame already around their sexuality. So the first part
Yeah.
is getting sober. The second part is healing the shame around their relationship to sex and their sexuality and their sexual needs and their sexual interests and what they mean to them.
So on that caveat, what does treatment look like in a nutshell? Don't give away all your secrets.
So I would say, like, in a nutshell, it is this sort of relearning process. It's kind of like going back to the beginning and really beginning with, like, like, first of all, one question I ask a lot of clients is, why do you have sex? What is the point of
Mm.
sex?
Hmm.
And so it's, to feel close to my partner, to feel connected, to have an orgasm, to release stress, uh, I don't know, to feel good about myself and like just starting to unpack all the different reasons why they have sex and like starting to be a little bit more intentional about the ones that are healthy and supportive of their self-esteem versus the ones that are like shame-based and sort of like objectifying or sort of like conquesty or just things that have potential to like sort of the external validation, like things that have potential to derail them. So starting
Hmm.
with just sort of like, why are we doing this? What is the point? And is this helping your cause or is this hurting your cause? And I would say starting there. And then like there's a lot of unpacking of the shame around their sexual interests, their sexual needs. I would also say, you know, for a lot of people who struggle with sex addiction, sex is sort of the only tool in their toolbox.
Mm.
It's the only
Hmm.
coping mechanism, or it's certainly the most solidified one. Like Andrew Huberman uses that definition of addiction of like a narrowing of the neural pathways, you know, that give us relief or pleasure. And so it's sort of, I talk about how with sex addicts, it's sort of tunnel vision. It's like the only way they see. And so a big part of this also is like expanding the toolkit so that like sex
Yeah.
can be sex and it's not like a binky, a soothing mechanism. It's
Hmm.
like having other mechanisms for them to self-soothe that sort of take the focus and the pressure off of sex.
Yeah. Because sex becomes like this faux intimacy
Mm-hmm.
thing
Right.
because they're not really being present and being into it in a real intimate way because they don't know what that looks like. But then it
Mm-hmm.
becomes everything at the same
Mm-hmm.
time.
Right.
Um, so then, how does someone go about finding a specialist if you're all booked and busy, or they're in another state? How do that? What? How? Like, what questions do they ask? How do they get into the right space?
Well, so here's kind of where it's tricky because there's sort of the CSAT world, which I know you're a part of, and then
Hmm.
there's the ASECT world.
Hmm.
Um, the ASECT world is highly, highly in opposition to the term sex addiction.
Yes.
They are not fans. They have made active statements against it. But what
Hmm.
they do believe in is what they call out of control sexual behavior. And from my perspective, the only difference between the two is the verbiage.
Exactly. I
The
know.
animal that they are describing is exactly the same, minus the
Yes.
word addict. And for
Uh-huh.
some people that matters. For some people, addict, it's just it's too offensive of a word. It feels like it carries too much stigma. And I support that and I understand that. And I would say for some people the word addict feels validating. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
this is this thing that I have zero control over. Like I am fully addicted and I don't know what else to do. So yeah, so it's a little bit of a
Well, even
um,
though, because I 100% agree with you, like it's just this whole, it's a verbiage thing, right? All, if we break it down underneath it, it looks the same. Um, so, but would treatment look different from CSAT to ASECT?
depends on who you see. There are a
Okay.
handful of us
Sure.
that straddle both worlds.
Yes.
But if you're with somebody sort of purely CSAT, you're more likely to follow sort of like Patrick Carnes's model, which is it initially has its roots in 12 step. And
Hmm.
so it is a little bit more 12 step based. Some people believe that it's a lot more sex negative. It does tend to focus more on stopping the behavior. There's very little within the CSAT model, at least the last I was familiar with it, that talks about how to recover your sexuality, how to have healthier
Yeah.
sex. It's a
Yeah.
lot
They're
more sort of like
developing.
let's stop the
Yeah.
bleeding. Right. Like there it's in development. It's been in
It's in
development
development,
for
coming
a
on.
while.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Whereas, so I would say like the OCSB model does emphasize that more. They do emphasize more like what is healthy sexuality for you? What is aligned with your values? What is sort of less shame-based sex for you? But to me, I think they focus a little bit less on how do we stop the bleeding. Like they're
Sure.
focusing more on like let's shift into healthy sex, but like there's a little bit less attention paid from my perspective to the impulsivity element, the
Yeah.
impulsivity and the compulsivity element. So One can theoretically, find a CSAT, I would say is one option. One can theoretically find an asect person who's trained in OCSB. They can find someone like me who's kind of straddles
Just
both
both.
worlds. But I think it also just speaks to, one of the things we know about therapy is that it's the most effective when the person feels comfortable with the therapist and it feels like there's a connection. And so I always encourage people to, have a consultation call, feel it out, talk to them,
Mhm.
make sure that whatever they're suggesting works for you and feels aligned with you. Because if somebody's saying, oh, yeah, you got to go to 12-step meetings and you got to do this, that, and the other, the person's like, whoa, that's not for me.
Yeah.
It's not going to help. Or if somebody's like, if somebody is, really acting out and they can't stop and they're, in bathhouses and public restrooms and doing who knows what and causing, and they're a danger to themselves in that regard, like, and they're going into an office and someone's saying, well, let's talk about how to have fun with this. Like, they're like,
Yeah.
this isn't
Yeah.
fun. I want to
Like, where's
stop. Like,
the
help me
yes?
stop.
Yeah.
Like, so, I think you got to find the modality that works for you.
Is there a female version or female equivalent of ED?
Uh, so the female equivalent or the female version is, I would say, really sort of more like the low libido. I feel like,
Mm.
as time rolls on, I feel like there are just more and more women who are just not interested. It is so low on their list of priorities. I see this the most in people who are working professionals, parents, just sort of like, the mental load for women. Like, and so, Emily Nagoski talks a lot about it in terms of like the gas and the
Mhm.
brakes and how there's so many things slamming on women's brakes these days that it's just a lot. She wrote a book on sex and she also wrote a book on burnout. And
Mhm.
burnout is all about, women burning the candle at both ends. And so I like to think of sex as sort of like the icing on the cake. And it's like if you don't have the meat and potatoes, you're not thinking about the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
You're just not.
Um, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your e-course. I love the name of it. 'Cause I'm like, that's so Natalie. When it's hard to stay hard, get straight to the point. Yes, can you tell us about what your program entails and what people can look for?
Sure. So I had this experience where I work with a lot of men who have ED, and so it's probably like 60% of my practice. And I had this experience where like the first 3 or 4 sessions were a lot of me just repeating the same information, a
Mm.
lot of the education piece, a lot of the questions that I go through, my assessment questions, just repeating them over and over, and then explaining to people how those things could have an impact. And they're like, "Huh? That could be an issue, or that could be part of it." And so it was just sort of like, what is a way that I can sort of make this more accessible for people? It's the course itself is $75, and so it's significantly more accessible than sessions with me. So this
Mhm.
idea of like, how do I make this more accessible for people? And if I'm saying this over and over and over, there must be a lot of men who this could speak to. So it is sort of like, what you would call cognitive behaviorally based. And so the first few lessons are unpacking the myths of erectile dysfunction. And then I go through like, what are the mental health psychological reasons? What are the potential relationship reasons? And what are the potential physical reasons? So going through all of like, why might this be happening? Helping people to reflect on their own self-awareness, what's going on in their relationship, what's going on in their body. And then the last few videos are like exercises and like sort of the what do I do with this? So there's a component on mindfulness and how to use mindfulness to ground your body
Mm.
and work through the anxiety. There's a component on communication, how to talk with your partner, how to facilitate conversations to take the stress and the pressure off. And then I also have a video for partners. So a lot of people are like, I don't even know how to talk to my partner about this, or my partner's mad at me
Mhm.
for this. And so like it's a video in which I, address partners directly and encourage them and talk to them about how to be supportive to their partner in the process.
And another part, you didn't mention it, but I like about it is that you have handouts
Yes.
also. So it's
Almost
like
every video
there
has like a
yeah.
handout, a worksheet, a space for people to like take the information that they're gathering and reflect on it. And so, I went through and I made sort of questions, like very lots of open-ended questions, food for thought, space for exploration of like, how is this impacting me? What are the things that, help my erections? What are the things that hurt them? So yeah, giving people an opportunity to like kind of unpack for themselves what could be happening here.
Which I love that piece because it's not just watching a video and, because then we
Right.
can just kind of, okay, I heard that and keep pushing. Now it's like a chance to apply things and dig
Right.
deeper. If you can't, like I said, if you can't do therapy sessions,
Right.
it's a kind of way of still having the therapy on yourself. So, which can be very productive.
Right. It's like and at your own pace,
Hmm.
pause for reflection.
Yeah. So how do the people find you, Natalie?
So let's see. You can find me on my website, creatingchangela.com. I'm on Instagram, at sex therapy LA. I'm on Twitter, but I don't really use it anymore because
Yeah.
it's no longer Twitter; it's now X.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say Instagram and my website are generally the best places to reach me.
Awesome. Thank you so,
Hmm.
so much for coming
Thank you
and
for
sharing your
having me.
expertise. That was awesome. And if you missed that and you want to get Natalie's information or just want to reach out to the show, that'll be in the description below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And as always, embrace your healing journey. Every step forward brings a new hope for tomorrow. See you next time.